Archaeodeath, walking in the footsteps of past funerals.
So very pleased to be here with Archaeodeath. I am Irina from Shield of Skuld. I'm a historian specializing in Viking studies and Old Norse literature. I have a YouTube channel and I'm also a history teacher. And I'm very looking forward to this conversation. Very sure it's going to be fruitful and we're going to learn a lot of things about history, archaeology and literature. Howard, to you.
Welcome, and it's great to see you and to have this conversation because we had a conversation as part of a broader panel a few months ago to do with the sort of Halloween day, type of spooky time. But it's really good to be able to follow on from that and also to discuss things that we have shared interest in, but also we bring our discrete expertise to a topic. And the Archaeodeath channel has been sort of having a whole series of interviews with people who come from different disciplinary and chronological specialisms, but of course we know each other from TikTok as well as YouTube, and both trying to do content.
I actually found you on TikTok. So.
Yes, and you do some great stuff on there, and really sort of it's really sort of surprising how much information you're able to pack into your videos. You're very sort of information rich and take people on a really great journey into your subject matter. But of course, we share we share interests in Nordic / Norse / Viking, these terms, type areas, and to do with death and the dead, really. And we were talking about the undead, weren't we? And different perceptions of it. It's difficult to know how to pitch to such a broad panel. But when when this topic has been with me for a long time, but it's not something I've particularly looked at. But it's the whole challenge of trying to explain the layers. And as someone who's got the expertise in the written sources, I mean, I find it very difficult to convey that. But I mean, how do you approach that? Trying to deal with the layers of, you've got, I don't know, 13th century sagas or later folklore stories, and then trying to explain what it may tell us about. I mean, I just thought that might be an opening point to address, is how do you sort of unpick the layers of these sources and what they might tell us about perceptions of death and the dead and the undead.
Right. Well, it's always difficult with the literary sources, isn't it? Because we're talking about sources written in the 13th, 14th century mainly, and we are trying to see the different layers they contain and how much of a pagan element they contain. I mean, until this very point, I'm not that convinced that these were actual Viking Age beliefs. So I've been trying to approach this from the point of view of memory studies lately. Yes. I think they're very good. Yeah, right. I think it's a very good starting point because I think revenants are really one of the best examples you can find of the past trying to get in touch with the present, or the present trying to haunt the past. And this is something I've noticed quite a lot in the legendary sagas, for example, because the legendary sagas, unlike the Icelandic sagas, which usually have these very, very violent revenants coming to trouble communities and to disrupt them, in the legendary sagas, you have heroes who actively seek out these monsters. So they're in this state of monstrosity, but at the same time, they are somewhat human. Some of them are these ancient kings with burial mounds, and you have to go as a hero to break the mound and to prove yourself, to prove your worth. And I think this is a very good example to see how people are trying to integrate the past, the distant past, into their own medieval approach to life, really. So I think that's really an interesting approach from the point of view of memory studies. And I think you're doing something very similar in terms of archaeology, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. Yeah.
The technologies of remembrance, I think, is a term you use in your book.
Yes, that's a term I took from the prehistorian Andrew Merrion Jones, who's now a professor at Stockholm University, of all places. He was at Southampton, and he was looking at Bronze Age mortuary practices and trying to get at the nitty-gritty of the practical gestures and the practical actions and the objects that sort of compose graves and rearrange graves. And I took that idea and thought, well, that idea is absolutely applicable to the early medieval data I'm dealing with. And so when I was doing my doctoral studies and soon after, and he was one of the contributors to my 2003 edited book on archaeologies of remembrance. I was thinking about how we actually use that idea of a sequence of actions. Technologies don't have to involve a linear sequence, and they don't have to involve a particular timescale, but it's a loose way of thinking about the practical actions that involve, reconnecting to or negotiating relationships with the past, whether it's recent past. And one of the big pushbacks I've had, and it keeps coming back, but from particularly medieval historians, actually, which is odd, is they seem to associate my view with this obsession, this idea that I'm claiming people had really deep time memories of ancient ancestors, which I've tried to go back through my old work and try to work out when I actually said that, and I don't think I have, but I think they've decided at conferences, or certain people have decided at conferences, that was my point, that they're all in touch with some deep ancestral past. And that wasn't my point at all. Actually, I think a lot of these societies are very fluid in their their workings of memory, and I've never really asserted that. But it's an interesting, we're all trying to, in different disciplines and across disciplines, react to different ideas. But I thought one of the powers of that approach was thinking about the practical actions and how they're then told on, the stories that then created through, whether you're burying the dead or then digging up the dead or entering into a burial mound, because people must have been investigating. So whether it's Norway or Iceland, people must have been still both encountering.
They would have seen it in the landscape.
And at one level you can say, well, they must have remembered the Viking Age, and well, maybe, but also the physical landscape is your mnemonic. It's constantly there. If time is not going to be experienced linearly, you're going to be sort of experiencing that same burial mound and telling stories about that mound, and every farm or every district is going to have its own stories that shift around some of these monuments, and maybe we've lost most of them, but we have some of them are recorded in these sagas. I mean, that was my default assumption, but I don't know if that's a bit naive or simplistic.
I think the landscape plays a very important part in how people relate to this whole idea of death. Because I was looking at the Yellowstad ship recently and what they have been doing there. And there are some very important layers. It was not like somebody in the Viking Age picked up that site. You have a site from the Roman Iron Age, a settlement nearby, and then you have another layer from about 500 AD, I believe, so the migration period. So it was already a well-established burial ground, so people could have formed, I think, a deeper attachment, generally speaking, to that particular place. So it would have made perfect sense for them to have this burial mound there. And I think with the passage of time, people got their ideas about who might have been buried there. I think if we move a little to the recent times, the modern times, there was this antiquarian interest very pronounced in the 17th, 18th century. And they were trying to link these mounds, regardless of their age, to some kind of ancient Scandinavian king or whatever. So we have this like snowball effect where layers and layers were added. Exactly. And it's very difficult to like peel them off to discover how memories were bundled up together or something like that.
We often look at this separately. I mean, the antiquarianism is a moment, and a very different moment. You can't say it's necessarily the same as what was happening in early centuries, but it's, as you say, snowballing is a brilliant way of putting it, because it's not a revelation that they're doing this. They're building on existing traditions and adapting, and maybe a lot of the time they're imposing from a central national perspective and ignoring what the local people are saying and just saying, oh, that's the mound of Ottar, or that's the mound of whoever. But still, it's the same interaction that we can see probably happening all the way through. So Viking Age period, people are reacting to previous sites, as you say, and then subsequently, though once established, those mounds are going to accrue their significance. And one of the things that I always think about, and that people I think react to this view, and I'd love to hear your view on this, is they assume that when we're talking about mounds, they have to be huge monuments, the big Oseberg ships or the Gamla Uppsala mounds. But actually, people, farming communities are going to be interacting with every lump and bump, and they can be telling stories about quite, to our mind, quite innocuous monuments that, because there's lots of other kinds of funerary monuments, standing stones, stone settings, they all, I think people perhaps default to thinking about big mounds, but actually, any particular district of Norway, Denmark, Sweden, or anywhere else in the Baltic region is going to have funerary monuments of different scales. I mean, some of they'll ignore, and some they'll just say, oh, we want to plow over those, we want to build on them, but others will have those stories, selectively reproduced. I think that's what, I don't know what you think of that.
Yeah, the ship settings are actually very interesting, and I'm very surprised that they're not really that mentioned in the sagas.
No.
Yeah, like I can't think of one single example when they're mentioned.
No, I don't think they are, you know, in
They're
terms of,
not.
unless
Yeah,
we don't understand the
that's very
description.
bizarre because they're
Yeah.
they're also like very prominent in the landscape. I don't know if you visited Gammelaive in Denmark, but
I
they're
haven't, but I've seen
yeah,
Alastana in Scania,
they're
and
absolutely
that's
fascinating. Yeah. But I do know, so with reference to the revenants, I have a passion for nowadays. They do make a difference between the cairn, which is described by the Old Norse term dis, and the general mound, so the haug. And I've noticed that the revenants who get really, really aggressive and do have this tendency of disrupting societies, communities, they tend to be buried in these places which are not really high status. So, for example, you have Thorolfur from Irbiga Saga. He is buried in a dis, and this also speaks volumes about his position in society. He's not really othered, like some of the characters are really presented as not being a part of this society, as being either from the Hebrides or from some other part of the northern world, which is not really Icelandic. But Thorolfur is Norwegian, so he is presented as a Norwegian settler. However, he is presented as a late settler. And that also speaks a bit about his position in society. So he is part of society, but at the same time, he's really not. And that's also due to the fact that he is trying to gain land from the other chieftains in the area by very aggressive means. So he doesn't respect these traditions of, compromising, arbitration, like creating this whole network that would ensure your support in the area and at the same time would ensure peace in the area. So he does not abide by the rules. And I think all these elements put together, plus the cairn, which would have meant a lower position in society, have this effect that he actually comes back and he's very aggressive again as a revenant. He starts killing cattle as well. So it's not really it's not only a psychological disruption, it is an economical disruption because the community cannot function in this way when he does that.
right.
Yeah.
So it's almost like they're often, I mean, I don't know how explicit this is. Your narrative is very clear, but you have to pick that from the hints in the sources, do you? It's very sort of like there's this hint that there's something about his life that was quite already off, that sort of set him up for this.
Yeah, this greed for land is something that characterizes a lot of these revenants, and this tendency of like I said, not abiding by the rules and trying to get more out of a situation. And he actually, Thorolfur also has a conflict with his own son, with Ankel, who is drawn into this conflict with Snorri Goði in the saga of the people of Eyri. But what I also found interesting is the fact that after his death, he manages, so when he comes back as a revenant and then he eventually turns into a magic bull, that's also very fun to read about. Yeah, because he's burnt and then his ashes are eaten by a cow, and then she gives birth to this huge calf, which grows fast into an ox. And this ox manages to kill the person involved in Ankel's death. So what's interesting for me is to notice that these characters are not only monstrous, but they do actually preserve some kind of liaison with the world of the living, with their family. In one way or another, they do still have this family relationship still going on. So they're in between. They're very liminal creatures. That's what I like about them most.
Are there any other parallels to that? Because I know that story with the bull, but I mean, at least I recall it now you mention it. But is that exceptional, or is there other parallels for that very unusual? Like cremation is not enough; they still come back because they didn't, for whatever.
Usually, cremation is enough.
Yeah. It's
Usually
almost
cremation
like
is enough.
it's
Yeah.
like one of those where it's like modern Hollywood horror movies where everyone
I
breathes a
know,
sigh and
right?
he's dead, and then suddenly
Yeah.
you know, and
Yeah.
it's like there's no way, you just keep
Yeah.
killing, to the point where it's pulp, and
Yeah.
then something still comes back, or there's
Yeah.
just as the closing credits come up, you see a hand crawling or something, and you go,
Right,
oh
right.
no, he's not dead. But that's really horrific, isn't it? And in societies where these stories are being told around the fireside and relayed and exaggerated, but it's very much physically present in the landscape. People would have been at least aware of these places, even if they're not residents in those locations. They would have had a sense of the topographies involved, even if these are being told quite some distance. Is that a fair? These would have been quite tangible, horrifying stories.
Yeah. There are a lot of stories about people engaging with these mounds, like doing something on a mound, or even expecting something from a mound. There is a story called, for example, Thorstein's Thottir Uxafots. And this Thorstein guy, he is a hero at the court of Olaf Tryggvason, and he steps on a mound at some point and has a very bizarre dream about a revenant called Brynjar, I think he is named. And then in the mound, he has a vision with two companies, one dressed in black and one dressed in red. And the red one has to pay tribute to, so the red one led by Brynjar, if I'm not mistaken, has to pay tribute to the one in black led by his brother Odder, because Odder has it's this kind of golden piece of some sort with magical properties, a healing stone of some sort. And then Thorstein starts to fight in order to release the men in red from this curse, which he does, and then he increases his reputation and so on. So I think it's a good example to see that people actually want to engage with these mounds and do have dreams and visions about them, visions about ancient times, with heroes and chieftains and kings, and doing something special there at any rate.
And do you think there's an awareness of, at least in the stories, because I'm thinking about Grettir, where of course his mound experience is in Norway, and Kar the Old, where there's an awareness Norway has an older landscape, a more ancient landscape.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a fair, or is that just my impression from one saga and it's not matched up with other things? That Iceland doesn't have that antiquity, because they're aware of their foundation story, or do you think that's a bit of a unfair,
Yeah, well,
contrast?
I think it would have been nice to have more Old East Norse sources for that.
That's true.
But unfortunately, we don't. So I think this is very much from the perspective of Old West Norse, the whole landscape. Yeah, it's very, very much linked to Norway. I would think. And I also think there is some kind of practicality here involved. While Icelandic authors were obsessed with this kind of story. We don't really have cremations in Iceland, do we? I mean,
no.
Yeah, for practical
Perhaps
reasons,
one or two,
I think they
but not
deforested everything in the first 2 centuries, and they were out of everything they could have used to cremate people. And I think that would have added an extra layer of fear that somebody might come back at some point and
combined with the
do something miserable to them.
The difficulties of digging unless you've got an existing fissure or in volcanic rock, the challenges of excavation to create a deep grave is something we forget, because it is seen as a mechanical process in the modern world, where you can get a mini digger in to do that work. But grave digging is never easy, and it's never clean, and it's never pleasant, and it's often rushed, or there's weather conditions. But when you have permafrost, or at least you have not permafrost, then certainly a winter really makes a difference on whether you can bury a body in with depth. That's another dimension. So the technologies and the environment do affect how people are thinking about the dead. I don't think I'm not trying to be deterministic, but I think we do have to reckon on how these landscapes affect how people deal with the dead, and also the scale, how dispersed the population would be in Iceland, over large distances, would affect how farms and burial grounds, which we know we've got archaeologically identified, are in relative proximity, but there's a broader landscape. Every farm you're approaching, you're approaching the living and the dead of that farm, the stories associated with them down the generations. That's fascinating in that sense. But do you think that then we should not discuss the Viking Age at all with these sources, or do you think they are just with careful application?
You have to dig up and surgically remove things that might seem authentic. I would say. I actually had a recent presentation about the tale of Volsi at a conference, and that was really a problem, because I don't know if you know it, the tale of Volsi.
Not off the top of my head, no.
With the magical horse's phallus that was used by this community, by this family.
Oh, yes, I recall it being discussed at least.
Bizarre, engaged in this bizarre fertility ritual. And I think this is a very good example because, if you look at the story from a pagan perspective, you can definitely find some things there, like this whole reference to people from a distant community engaging in something weird and bizarre and that has some kind of fertility overtones. But if you look at the story more attentively, you are going to notice that a lot of these things might have been just invented by the author to create this air of paganisque, I think is the more correct term. Yeah, and this is also part of a collection of stories, other stories, for example, the saga of King Gautrek, which also has some very bizarre elements, like this myth of the old people throwing themselves off a cliff. You can also find it there.
Oh yes, I remember that.
That's from Gautrek saga, yeah. And yeah, for some reason, people believe that's something that would have been done in the Viking Age, like generally speaking. So if you look at the literature, the way the story is constructed, you're going to notice a lot of common elements with the saga of Gautrek, and I think the author is deliberately trying to create this idea that we are dealing with an ancient pagan ritual, when in fact he is making a lot of stuff up. First of all, in order to show that these isolated communities from mid and northern Norway were absolutely devoid of any idea about what Christianity was, and therefore it was important for Christianity to come to them. And yeah, then we have these Christian kings coming and spreading the good word and trying to convince them that what they were doing was not really correct. You also have in the story, for example, a lot of references to how old age would have been seen in society, because not everyone in the household engages in this ritual. So it's a ritual where essentially this horse's phallus becomes a revenant, if I can express myself like that, because it is shown as something that comes back to life in order to bring prosperity to the household. But not everyone is thrilled about this whole situation. The old man of the household, for example, refuses to take part in the ritual. Generally speaking, the women want to take part in the ritual. Therefore, I also mentioned this sexual overtone. So this could also indicate this idea that, at some point you have to make way for your descendants to come and take over the community and the household and so on. So I think the story is very relevant also for this mentality and the ways people tried to represent age in these communities as well, because not everyone was very thrilled about this whole idea of bringing prosperity via this resurrected penis into the house.
See, from what you say, it's almost like, and again, I defer to your expertise on this. It sounds like you're like Eric the Red saga, where the CRS is being presented, and people have discussed that ad nauseum about how this seer is going from farmstead to farm.
It's a very detailed account, yeah.
And then, but if you can't, you've got to understand that from what you're saying in the context of the tensions the narrative is trying to set up between a pagan past and a Christian future, and that is something conscious and discursive within the text, and you can't just like take the account in isolation as some kind of window onto pre-Christian practice.
Yeah, it's very difficult to make a connection here, because this is something, okay, the vulva described in the saga of Eric the Red, we have many other examples from the sagas, not in that with that level of detail. It is the most detailed description we can find of a practitioner of magic, but in the tale of Volsi, it's quite a unique account.
Okay.
And you can make attempts, like I said, to connect this kind of story with some ancient mentions, for example, of leaks on some objects from the migration period written in the Elder Futhark, because it is described that this organ was also wrapped in herbs and so on. So this whole idea of fertility could also be transmitted via using the word lauk, for example, which means leek or laukas, on several objects in the Elder Futhark. But I think that's quite far-fetched. The time span is way too long. So 500 AD, 600 AD for an inscription in the Elder Futhark, and then you have a 14th century story, trying to explain fertility rituals in Norwegian households.
Yes.
To me, it's a bit, over the top. And there are also these like weird white stones in the landscape sometimes in Scandinavia, but then again, it's really difficult to make a connection here. So I think if we look at through the perspective of an ideologized account of a Christian author, that makes much more sense, because the purpose of the author is to create this allegedly authentic pagan atmosphere. Yes. In order to promote this idea that the pagan past needs to be left behind, because this is the new world, so you have to adapt to it.
And I think in that regard, I have to ask the challenging question that literally I won't name names, but I have literally read in the last few months brand new literature that still says, oh, we've got so much diversity in burial practice. We've got so much variability over time and geography. They make all these obvious concessions that we all agree. And they still say, but there was a pagan Viking worldview, a singular. No, so they do this concession. They play this game of saying, and here's the saga literature, so we still have this kind of desire. So, and I've literally encountered this, and I'm going, okay, so I'm with you. Your diversity, variability, complexity, then Christianity is part of the mix, when and how, and all this messiness, which I love, and I try to convey to my public audiences, but they still, in the academic sources, want to go, and they thought this, and here's the saga of. And how do you feel? How do we go beyond that? Because it does feel that we're still going around in circles with that desire to, academically as well as in the public. We can't just blame, modern day practitioners for wanting this. Academics crave this singular, Viking era way of death or vision of death.
Yeah.
Is that fair? Or do you think that's, I mean, I don't know what your sense of the literature is, but I still keep seeing it.
What we also crave is to find gods that are specific for something.
Of course,
like Thor, the god of thunder, and Odin, the god of war, and so on and so forth. I don't know. I think this stems from the Age of Enlightenment, the whole taxonomy obsession. We'd have things really clearly categorized in our minds, and we cannot wrap our heads around the fact that there would have been much more diversity than we can account for. It's definitely a very, very difficult question. I mean, I also admit that I use the term religion.
Yeah.
But I think it's good to define it before you use it. So when I try to use the term religion, I generally mean this whole collection of paganisms, so the plural, because there's so much we cannot possibly know, and there is so much that stems from this whole medieval tradition as well, to try to create a coherent story. Thinking, of course, about the Prose Edda, the Snorra Edda, Snorri Sturluson, very influential, but also in the Poetic Edda. I mean, we have a lot of references to myths we have no other source for, like, for example, when it is mentioned at some point that Heimdallr and Loki were fighting as seals. I don't know what to make out of this. We have zero references to such a myth. So there was definitely a lot that was lost. We're also a bit uncertain about what the motivations of the monks were who wrote these particular myths and not others. What other poetry was in circulation. In skaldic poetry, it's also very difficult because you have like these very, very complex metaphors and kenningar, and you don't really have explanations because it was poetry written in the 9th century. They didn't really feel the need to explain what stood for what, because it would have been common knowledge, I suppose, at least at the courts of Norwegian kings. So I think we're dealing with a very, very difficult problem, and at the same time, I don't think we should completely ignore the fact that they would also have had some kind of common threads, but I don't think they should be overreacted as well. And yeah, for example, yesterday I actually found an interesting inscription from medieval Bergen on a rune stick mentioning the goddess Vor. And yeah, it is an inscription stating it's someone complaining about an unrequited love. So it's kind of like a mundane inscription, but it mentions the goddess Vår. And we don't know a lot about this goddess. We don't even know if she existed. She appears on a list of Osinjur in the Skålskaparmál of Snorri Sturluson.
Ah, she's one of those, and, right? Okay.
Yeah, and
I forget them all, to be honest.
Yeah. And it is theorized that the term Varangians also comes from this word. Might be possible because Vor actually means oath, so it's just an oath in Old Norse. But to me, it seems like a lot of these characters we find on these very, very comprehensive lists, Snorri composed, they might have just been personifications of different concepts and not like real deities, if I might express it like that. So I think on this account, I think archaeology might be able to help us a lot more to uncover this diversity, because there are a lot of deities about whom which seem to have been important, but about whom we know very, very little. For example, the god Uller, or the god Tyr, and in Denmark it is full, so the toponymy it is full of the name Tyr, Tisø, and so on. But again, we only have like, I don't know, 2 stories about Tyr. One of them, I think he joins Thor on this expedition to retrieve a cauldron for making mead, and the other one is his role as the one who manages to calm down Fenrir. Yeah, but other than that, we don't know, who that was. It's also interesting if you look at his name is cognate with Zeus and Deus. So you could think about the fact that maybe at some point he would have had a more important role in Norse mythology or pre-Norse mythology. Maybe he was more important than Odin, but there's really no certain way to say it. So unfortunately, we have to deal with these limitations. I really want for a Viking mythology to exist as well. But unfortunately, the term itself, Norse mythology, it's not really Norse mythology, it's Old Icelandic mythology. Yeah.
But that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, I want to just, don't wish to correct you, but I wish to make a distinction, if I may, between you saying you use the word religion, and I wasn't criticizing people who default to popular terms, because we all do it. We all I was referring to academic texts that, despite literally talking about the diversity, still their thesis is the identification of that cohesion, which is a different thing, I feel, because I think we all have to, both in talking across disciplines and talking with others, we all have to default to terms, and as long as we qualify them, I think, I'm not saying it's okay, but I think it's less of an issue if we are responsible in. Let's talk about religion in the Viking Age. What I mean by that is this, and then you can rapidly go places. It's not, we shouldn't like not use these terms.
Yeah.
But I just want to make clear that what I meant was, it was, I've been reading things, so I'm going, hang on, you've gone through all these hoops, and still what you seem to be trying to get at is this one, and it is very difficult, isn't it? But I mean, in terms of death rituals and death beliefs, these undead stories, getting back to them, they are incredibly. There's tropes and themes, but they're all different from what you're saying. They all seem to have burning is the ultimate way of getting rid of but there's still different kinds of
decapitation, but that doesn't always work.
No.
Yeah.
But so you lop off a head, and then the head's still speaking to you or doing things to you, or its eyes are upsetting you, and then so you're burning.
And we have Mimir's head as well. I don't know if it's connected to any of this. I think that's rather connected to Celtic mythology, if I'm not mistaken. The Celts really had an obsession about talking heads, the wise heads. That's an interesting connection, at any rate. And
yes, and there's how much this is coming from, in a intellectual environment with monks writing this down, or just in the oral tradition? Because even by the 12th, 13th century, Icelandic society is getting exposed to, all over Europe-wide and Eurasian-wide ideas. So they're not like in a little bubble on their own, are they? Like a preserved, little fossilized.
Absolutely, yeah.
Edge. But that's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, the tradition of the literary tradition of the quest, for example, the quest that comes from chivalric literature, and it's very often used. So the revenant as this character that stands for a quest and an obstacle that needs to be overcome for the main character, the hero, to move on. So I think many of these choices can also be regarded as just literary choices in order to promote or enhance the hero and the journey of the hero. So this kind of like narrative disruption to promote the social mobility of the hero.
Well, that's interesting. So do you think that, even if we can't literally take these stories to tell us about earlier centuries and about, we can still perhaps perceive some themes that perhaps are connect together these societies? I mean, I don't know, for example, if we, the concept of a Valkyrie can be mapped back, as some archaeologists and historians have tried to, from earlier centuries. But I think the idea of women who may be caring for the dead in different contexts is almost a global phenomenon that we, that perhaps there is some level we can see a connection. I don't know what you feel about that kind of thing. Those who care for the dead or deal with the dead, specialists and actors. Do you think that's a way we can connect the sources?
Well, Valkyrie, I think they were part of the ideology of war, if you ask me, and I think they would have been much more terrifying in their incipit than they were developed into these very romantic or romanticized female characters. As we have, for example, the poem Daradayod. I know some studies have been done on this poem, showing that it is an older poem, so 10th century or so. And if you read the Daradayod, it's very much of a horror story what's going on there, because they raise this loom of death and what the objects they're using, so the sword and the beater, the warp and so on, they are made out of the organs of the warriors who have fallen in battle. So the fact that they have been tamed, these characters, over time, I think it has to do with this idea of the warrior also being convinced to participate in war. So it was a little bit of propaganda here in the use of the Valkyrie as images. This whole masculine idea, how they try to represent death and the afterlife. They would have been part of this world, and also inspiration from the real world. I think that is a possibility as well, because Valkyrie are often shown in skaldic poetry, and also in archaeology. If we accept these small figurines with women carrying beakers that actually being Valkyrie, they would have been the ones bringing the warriors to Valhall. So they contributed to this whole world and worldview, like this metaphysical mead hall.
And that's really interesting, is in terms of one of the things the connections between the literary sources and the archaeology is, the fact that we do have, not all graves, but we take some of the more exceptional graves out of context. We talked about diversity, so I have to say that. But we do have that people are furnishing graves, at least up until the 10th and sometimes into the 11th century in different parts of Scandinavia. And I wanted to know whether we have really we're approaching that evidence in an appropriate lens from how we look at the literary evidence. I mean, do you think we're doing it the right way to think about these objects, why people are putting objects with the dead, as opposed to why people are, the ideas, the mythologies that they may be generating about afterlife ideas? Because I'm fascinated by how sometimes we're still working with 19th century sort of ideas about, why objects are placed with the dead. I don't know if you come across stuff like that. Or...
Yeah, I don't know. I think the concept itself of deviant grave, I don't know if is this really a term we can use, because I know from a case in Gotland, on the island of Gotland, the cemetery in Koparsvik.
Oh yes.
And it has been described in literature for a very long time as deviant, but I don't know how deviant it is, because I think half of the people buried there are in prone
Yes.
burials. So can we consider that deviant at all, or what is actually the definition of deviant? As far as I've seen in literature now, there is a tendency to classify them as sorcerers' graves. There has been quite a lot of work done on that. Sorcerers' graves, in the sense of, okay, you see some bizarre objects that shouldn't be there, and perhaps these people were engaging in a social role during their lifetime that was considered, maybe marginalized by society, or something that they were not supposed to be doing. So I'm not very sure if the objects really reflect this reality, but I think they reflect the reality of how the community would have seen these people, what they chose to represent these people. So I'm thinking about Klinta, the Klinta grave,
Yes.
for example. Yeah, that's a very interesting example, because it defies expectation, doesn't it? All these objects there are associated. What was it again? The woman was associated with weapons, and
Yes.
the man was associated, with some textile objects or so on. There's also a staff in that grave, an interesting one. I think it has a hole depicted on it, which is very, very rare.
Hall, yes.
Yeah. So that's also a question for me, and that's also something I wanted to ask you, what your opinion is about this whole concept of deviant burial, or what counts for you as a deviant burial.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is a topic I know, I teach about and I talk about, and I the way I approach it with students, and whether this is something I've partially taken this to print, but I don't think it's something I have fully outlined as a thesis. It's a problematic, again, strict categories, you've got to look at the local and regional context. Some of these practices we're seeing for late Romano-British decapitation burials, the consensus is moving rapidly towards these are people who are executed. This is about judicial execution. And what you're seeing is that this judicial execution in a Roman world, where the family are being given the corpse back with its head lopped off, and they get to bury it. So the care of the burial is sometimes contradicting the violence of the death, not because this was some honored ritual of, we must release the head, the spirit. This is because this person is being given back by the Roman authorities to the peasant family with, now you can bury him, or her, and so if that's the case, and like in the third, fourth centuries, you're looking at a very violent, actually more repressive than the early Middle Ages society, where despite the fact we don't have weapon burials and we don't have these stylized representations of, it's a very repressive culture of agrarian societies with a strict hierarchy, where the deviant burials are evidence of a high level of judicial execution. I mean, I'm not saying it would have still been exceptional or memorable, and they're doing it in a very violent way. Moving through to the 5th, 6th century in early Anglo-Saxon England, I think we're looking at more exceptional burials that are probably a mixture of judicial and issues of fear and dread and othering, but they're still burying them in community cemetery. So I think they're clearly not, so horrific that they're taking them to, the edge of of the landscape and disposing them. So I think it's very variable. And the way I approach it with students is saying these are about configuring different kinds of emotional intensity and different kinds of emotional response. And we shouldn't be expecting coherence and a sort of legally defined definitions of when you do what. And I think you're looking at societies really kind of responding to circumstance, personality, and audience, and treating the dead in a variety of ways. So I'm a little skeptical about saying if they're prone, they must be sorcerers, or if they're heads off, they must be this. Because I think what you're looking at is sometimes you're looking at the guy who died unexpectedly and no one knows, and everyone's terrified of what this might mean. And there's some supernatural concern. In other cases, it's because the local jarl, cut his head off because he was a complete and utter cattle thief or whatever it may be, or kept molesting everyone, and that's why it's happened. And so I think we've got to be practical about this and realize we're dealing with societies that have ideas and frameworks, but are negotiating this in real time, and therefore I'm a little cynical about associating all burials with spiritual paraphernalia as seers' graves, and I've been very cynical of Neil and Leszek's work on that. Not because I don't think their work's
on
interesting.
the magic staffs.
Yeah, the magic stuff, because I think it's not that I don't think that those identifications are useful, but I just think it's a default for every grave. They must have the same. And I think Leszek, when I've talked with Leszek about this, he's totally concedes that point. We are probably looking at a much more messy set of categorizations, but but still they want to create that narrative. So I have to come into a bit of disagreement. But likewise with decapitated burials, I think we are looking at human sacrifice sometimes. I think we are looking at judicial execution sometimes. And sometimes we're just looking at people who were haunting people after death. So I think we may have some resonances with later sources, but I don't know. I think it's just about looking at patterns rather than trying to be too definitive. But that's my kind of approach. It's a bit wishy-washy.
Yeah. I don't think we can make a classification. I mean, to state for certain, like you said, like this was a deviant, this was not deviant, and so on. I mean, like a clear-cut classification. I think that's impossible. Have to contextualize the whole picture. I don't know. There are some couple of runic inscriptions telling people to stay in their graves. I think those are good candidates for this general fear of the dead coming back. But on the other hand, I don't know, in the case of the prone burials in Kopashvik, maybe that was also a case of the terrain favorizing that position. I think Matthias Toplak wrote an article about that, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, the supernatural explanation, we love that, don't we? That's not always the case. Yeah, he demonstrated that the prone burials actually could indicate a Christian burial, right, of humility, because he made all these comparisons with legal codes in Grogos, people buried at the cemetery margin, and he also compared them with some early Christian communities.
Right.
So yeah, that was the conclusion of the article, that this was actually either something created by the landscape, the characteristics of the landscape, or it was a gesture of Christian humility.
I haven't read that, but I've heard people talk about it. I haven't had time to dig that out, but that's really interesting. So that's a completely different take on it, isn't it? In a society that's adopting Christianity and I think we do have to look at individual cemeteries and burials, and not, again, we got this. Again, we have archaeologists and historians wanting a pan-Scandinavian single explanation for everything from the Isle of Man, the Viking world more broadly, not just Scandinavia, but we have a burial on the Isle of Man, a burial in Island Bridge, Kilmainham and Island Bridge Cemetery in Dublin, or a burial in Western Iceland. We want the same framework, and often it's not quite so easy. And I think there is a broader story with these deviant burials. I do want to say that, and I've been ranting about this on my TikToks, is there is a broader chronological problem here of our modern horror stories and our desire to almost sensationalize the dead, which loves to spiritualize the people in the past as superstitious, but differentially, particularly the further north and eastern you go, the more superstitious and backward and primitive and fearful people are. And we've got that, a lot of that is happening in our Western culture more broadly, that the vampire burials of, say, Poland or elsewhere in Central and Eastern Europe are fit into that narrative. And so I have been trying to sort of point out that we can't simultaneously spend our time wagging fingers at people for being derogatory about indigenous Native American burial and just let slide these deep pernicious stereotypes of the Irish as well. It's not just Eastern Europe. The Irish are all spiritual, airy fairy, and everything's about the fear of the fairies. And we love to do that. And then anything in Central or Eastern Europe is all, the peasants were fearful of the vampires. And yet I'm not saying those ideas weren't there, but I think we have to be careful about these blanket cross-cultural. So when I saw German archaeologists recently did and it's just something they said to the press, and they said they found a Neolithic burial with a big stone on top of it, and it must have been a vampire. And I'm going, oh, for crying out loud, come on. I know you've got to say something to the press, but I think, we've just got to rein this in just a little bit and be a bit more nuanced. And and it's easy for me to say, because if I was talking to a camera or to a local press person, you have to say something interesting about your discovery.
Yeah.
So I understand that I'm being a bit unfair.
Yeah, you have to draw attention to it in one way or another. Yeah.
But equally, though, this does rapidly unravel into popular culture, and it often I don't know if I told you about this, but I dug through and found the origin of a particular online mythology about Loki, and found it originated in a PDF of a Norwegian language excavation report from only as recent as 2015. And it's just, the archaeologist in this report says something like, and these images could be Loki, and before you know it, Etsy store is full of these pendants saying Loki pendants, and it's not wrong, because we don't know, it could be right, but it's
I think we should be comfortable with that. I mean, this is also something we should be comfortable with, these limitations, and not really try to push an interpretation until there's nothing left out of it. I think we have a very serious problem with that. I mean, the public really wants these clear answers about stuff, what did happen and what didn't happen, and they want us to tell them.
But I think many
distinct.
Many of the public are very happy if you don't say no, that's wrong, but actually this is really interesting. Did you realize that this only was first suggested in a magazine article in 2018, and actually it was post-pandemic, and and I think they like that. They don't feel like we're constantly telling them off. They feel, oh, that's interesting, I didn't know, and is that really where it's from, or from the TV show Vikings, or from a museum exhibition in Copenhagen in 2020 or 2010 or something. I think we can be quite relaxed about that. We should be happy about that, rather than just telling off the public when we're often creating these problems, whether it's so yeah, it is it's an ongoing challenge, isn't it? But people want to fix certain ideas, and I think we've got to constantly keep people on their toes to be meddlesome, in a sense, to be a bit Loki. We've got to be a bit trickery and get people keep people sort of thinking.
Yeah. So I don't know what new challenges you're facing on TikTok now, but one of my main challenges is the one about the runes, speaking of clear-cut answers, because people don't really understand that there is no way of saying how they, by saying they, again, who do we mean? Do we mean the Norse? Do we mean whatever Germanic peoples? Do we mean the Germanic peoples of Tacitus, whomever? But there is no way of saying how they would have used them in divination. Then, like, nobody had a manual for that.
No.
And that's also very, very tricky topic, because much of what has been written now in neo-pagan circles actually stems from like these very racist, folkish representations from the 19th and 20th century, with the rune gymnastics and whatever was going on in the Orden and other such Nazi circles. So that's always a problem. That's always going to be a problem, I think, in this line of work, because you have to deal a lot with things that have not been, maybe cast out enough from the public imagination.
And that's a really interesting, because I must admit I've chickened out of dealing with runes. I've dealt with it a bit in my, but there I don't have the I don't honestly have the expertise, and secondly, and the linguistic and literary background. But also I know that there's two sides to it, because if I debunk the spiritual interpretations of runes, that can sometimes serve some of these more extremist views, because the messy ideas that are out there actually, while some of those ideas are themselves from some nasty sources, there's also a very sort of secular, or people are just loving to dump on some of those groups because it serves other extremist narratives. So it's kind of, I've tried to keep out of that, because I agree with you. I 100% agree with you. It's quite insidious. But I don't know. One of my most recent practical concerns is trying to explain that there was a Scandinavian people settling Greenland, but then Greenland, that colony, we've been spending decades archaeologically excavating the evidence of the failure of that colony for a variety of purposes.
Yeah.
I've critiqued the use of the term colony and how that has connotations, but also, obviously in the current climate with America's claims on the North Atlantic, I'm trying to point that there's also Danish nationalists that are using this, Norwegians, and I'm just trying to sort of say, let's actually talk about the history before you say that Denmark has ruled this place for 800 years, like some right-wing populist, politicians have said. No sympathy with Trump and his idiocy, but equally we've got to be aware there are deeper nationalistic and colonial problems here that we've got to, so that's my current nightmare. But I wish I hadn't said anything now, because I've just had so many comments. But most Scandinavians are backing me, and historians and archaeologists. It's just work, isn't it? And stress and trying to deal with it. But the runes are a difficult thing, and attitudes to death and the dead. I don't want to invalidate anyone's personal spiritual beliefs and their own engagement with the past, because there's plenty of different religions that do this.
There are also nice. The Ásatrúarfélagið, for example, in Iceland, who they actually have a temple now. I think it's ready, or something. Temple. But they're very much aware of the fact that what they're doing is like this creative reinterpretation of the past, and they're not really. They're not saying that they're reconstructing it. So I think that's what my main problem is with people claiming to reconstruct a past that actually never existed the way they imagine it to be. Like, I have nothing against if you have some beliefs that, well, some of them might be, like I said, a creative reinterpretation of something, or it's something new and you are aware that you're doing something new. But I do have a problem with the Reconstructionist movement and with the ethnicist movement. I mean, the ethnicist movement, I think it's futile to say why. But Reconstructionism is also very, very problematic. But then again, there are also some currents which seem to be very much aware that this is, something
I suppose
rather artistic, like it's kind of like an artistic religion.
I suppose that's why I should have perhaps clarified what I meant when I said before that I'm reluctant to criticize these modern spiritual uses, because what I find is that some of the people joining me in the fight to point out some of the historical problems are the historical reconstructionists who believe they've got a true original use, and that they want to debunk all the modern creative uses. And I think, they understand my point. They're with me. And then I go, hang on, they're not. They know the truth, and they know that's what they're claiming. So you find yourself being weaponized very quickly into thinking you're doing good and pointing out some reliable sources, even though I'm not an expert on the literature. And I think I've done some good there, and then you realize that some of the characters that seem to be interested are just trying to sneak up to me, because they're basically they're some of the most nasty people you could, but they find ways of hiding themselves in plain sight, and that's the so that's why I suppose I totally agree with you, and I've seen your videos about that and the problem, the history of that, and it's absolutely essential that we have no time for those characters and their agendas, but they're never far away. And that's the thing, and I've been trying to explain to people how it's never been a new thing, that I've been doing public talks long before, early in the digital age, 20 years ago, and you'd be in rooms talking to groups of people, and within the same group you'll have, I'm talking about Britain here, and you'll have people just local people, but then you'll have someone with you're never going to be speaking to a politically neutral audience. Every local group of people, there's one person who's has a particular religious agenda, a political agenda. And I've had some really sort of scary moments of talking to people and realizing how extreme their politics and their investment in the past is, their identities. And it's obviously that sometimes it's mixed up with all manner of mental illnesses and or lack of education, but sometimes it's people who've thought really clever, have really researched it, and they know almost everything I know on this subject, and yet they've got a completely coherent ideology that's so pernicious, and you just feel, oh my God, you're like staring into the face of something really quite evil, really. and you're there in a room surrounded by other people in a perfectly natural setting, and you're going, okay, that's interesting, and you're doing that whole British thing of, oh yes, that's interesting. Sort of, I feel like I'm Louis Theroux. I'm just observing. I'm not actually part of this. But it's really quite horrifying how, this stuff sits under the surface in some groups, and so it's something I'm very nervous about. But we can't ever escape from. But we can't ever just pretend politely it's not there. We've just got to find our ways of pushing back and being responsible, I feel.
Yeah, well, then from their point of view, I think we're the culprits here, because we're the ones with the left-wing ideologies, woke and whatever other terms have been turned into these, concepts.
I get. It's obviously it goes in waves. I haven't been called woke for at least 3 weeks now.
Yeah, that's quite a long time.
It's the new one is DEI, isn't it? So it all goes in fashions. Part of the DEI agenda, or the woke agenda, or the trans agenda, or whatever it is. It's an agenda, But yes, it is quite scary, and they are looking to cause trouble with my university and the academic system. They're absolutely coming for academics. Anyone with an education is seen as a threat rather than a. But
because we're following the mainstream narrative. This is something I often see in my comments. I'm following some mainstream narrative, and I don't know, there were some people requiring me to demonstrate that the runes are not 15,000 years old.
15,000.
Yeah, or even more. And I also have some people speaking about, I don't know, Nephilim cults or whatever. Yeah, these kind of connections that really cannot be possible between, I don't know, some Mesopotamian, Ugaritic religions and Norse mythology or whatever.
But that's the challenge of dealing with this.
And there's always this motivation, because, we're too academic, and thus, per consequence, we must have some sort of agenda ourselves, and it is this mainstream agenda that seeks to destroy people's identities. But that leads to an area we've already sort of segued into, this move away from what we can say about the ancient past to how we operate in the present. But do you feel, despite that ongoing noise of nonsense, if you like, online, do you feel that you're able to effectively do good work online? Do you feel it's making a difference? Or because for me, you're one of the few people I see who stuck at it and kept going at this online presence. It's very rewarding. It's still very rewarding. It's after my PhD, it's probably the best project I've ever begun, and I really want to continue it. I have a lot of ideas, and I'm trying to do my research as best as possible. Also hoping to publish my PhD this year.
Oh,
so or a revised version of it. And that's also going to be very problematic because my PhD is actually about the uses of Norse mythology in the metal music scene. And
wow.
But then I kind of ditched the topic after I finished, so 2017, and I'm not going to be enjoying coming back to it, but I really want to publish it, so this is also something I really want to do this year.
Your thesis, I didn't realize. My
thesis was on my thesis is on metal music.
Fantastic.
And it had completely the opposite effect, because when I started the thesis, I was like, I want to write something where I can combine all the things I'm passionate about. What am I passionate about? Well, I like metal music, I like the early Middle Ages, and I like Scandinavian languages. Oh, okay, now I'm going to do something about that. At the end of the thesis, I told myself I'm never listening to Viking metal again.
I kind of get that. It's like the it's not the same as the metal music, but it's like that for what it's like that every time I hear certain bars, even the half a second of a TikTok with a certain music, and I deliberately troll some of my friends by sending them links to, here's another one, my mother, and I just get these swear words back to me, but it's so
I basically showed how they create myths based on other myths, so the mythologization of the mythology.
Absolutely. Oh, that's fantastic. Oh, you should publish that. I think there's a but I know you say it seems like a long time ago, but just to assure you, in the world of academia, that's recent, and there's so few.
I know it's still recent, so that's why I'm going to do it this year, and see the reaction. Probably a lot of the people from the metal scene are going to hate me, but that.
But you're not going to listen to it anymore, so
Yeah, sorry. No, I actually I still listen to Falkenbach. I think they did a pretty good job. Actually, it was a one-man band, but it was a more like detailed approach to mythology. But other than that, yeah, no, it's something extremely full of cliches and again, all kinds of myths related to ancestry, masculinity, and things that I am really, really fed up with.
because Simon Trafford did an article about that about a decade or two
I
ago,
know,
didn't he? Yeah,
yeah,
you know,
yeah,
and
yeah,
I know about his. I've seen him present about that
yeah,
type of thing,
yeah.
but there's been a lot done. There's a lot. It's never, you know, a lot of new work, and I'd love to hear, you know, a broader thesis dedicated to that, and that would be fantastic. And you know, it overlaps in so many other ways, doesn't it? Because even, you know, whether people have not listened to actual Viking metal, do associate Vikings with metal at some deep level, don't they? There's some
Well, the
kind of
show contributes a great deal to it. I mean, they do look like a gang of metalheads. Yeah.
And I've tried to be merciful to the show and say, well, there's many good things about these shows, and yet equally
Yeah,
now
that's
I
what I
can't.
was going to ask you. I think you watched a lot more of the show than I did. I must confess that I did not have the patience because I don't know, I deal with it quite a lot and I don't want to do that in my free time as
No,
well.
no,
So I
I
ditched the show, I think, after the first season or so on. But yeah, I wanted to ask you if there is something or what are the positive aspects
okay.
in these representations, and also if maybe you have something from popular culture related to Vikings or Anglo-Saxons that you actually enjoy, like some
Okay,
kind of guilty pleasure.
my weakness my weakness with Vikings is no matter how bad the battles are, how bad the hairstyles are, how actually irrelevant the plots are to anything, and I can still see where the ideas are coming from, and that's a curse. It's almost like, oh no, they're not going to. Ah, there we go. There's happened now, right? But you know, so there's a lot of stuff that I'm just going. But I still have a weakness for. The emotional content. I love the fact that they're dealing with death, and this is where, despite my despite my better intentions, I agree with Neil on this. Neil Price on this point is that I do think there is a power and a cultural impact on the way they've shown a variety of different ways people deal with death and the dead. That's yes, there's some cringy representations of Norse gods that suddenly just appear, and or is it a god? And but I think the ambiguity of whether they actually believe any of this shit or not is a positive thing, and
Right.
the variety of ways they show death rituals, drawing on legends and myth and archaeology, is I think healthy. Not if you take the individual snapshots of the show, you can see there's white supremacists using iconic images and
Yeah,
memes,
well,
and
that's
then there's
inevitable.
people who just go, "Oh, Vikings, Ragnar Lothbrok," but actually. The other link to the emotion and the attitude, the variety of death ways. The other thing that I like about it, and this is again, I don't do it out of deference. I do it out of almost reluctance. I agree with Neil Price's review of the show and his involvement in the early series, is that it does show arcs of people who change their hairstyles, change their behaviors, and you do have a lot of a link to that because you're looking at such a big, long show of 50 hours or whatever it is. You do get almost by accident some really interesting scenes that show fishing, boat repair, uh, you know,
Yeah, just community life.
yeah,
Yeah, everyday life.
a
Yeah.
goat wandering around, you know, and I'm not saying it's all accurate, but I think that immersive, almost quotidian, that
Yeah.
daily
Yeah.
life and the emotional relationship with death. So there's this one scene where Floki is burying Helga and he's on his own because she loses her mind and he's no longer popular, and he buries her alone and he talks through every object he puts in her grave, and it's
Right.
completely fictitious. I don't think it's taking from any, correct me if I'm wrong, any saga story or anything. And like when Lagertha finally gets buried, they every object they put with her, they say it's a very modern way of death, but it's powerful for audiences. And I can't say it wasn't touching to see some of the funerary portrayals. So that's my defense of Vikings. I'm not saying this it's good. And Vikings Valhalla, I watched all 3 shows, and I'll
wow.
I'll plot spoiler. Can I tell you the plot spoiler at the end of season?
Yeah, please. I don't think I'm going to watch it.
Right, so the end of season 3, they obviously wanted to get up to the Norman conquest, but they end with the death of Canute, and Canute gets his burial in Winchester. Does he get buried? Yeah, Winchester. So he gets buried in Winchester, and you see the Christian funeral, and and it's all they're all being buried in a church. But then Emma knows that what he really wants is a Viking funeral, and so Queen Emma and one loyal retainer are standing on the top of the cliffs of Dover, and he fires the single flaming arrow, and then he's in this long ship of flames on the English Channel.
And it's just like, give up the flaming arrows in these shows. It's medieval. It has to have some flaming arrows.
They just couldn't not do it. They had to do it. And I'm sitting there just screaming at them, going, "No, why?" And she says something like, "As Viking heritage demands it," or something. And I'm going, "Oh, what?" But
no, she wouldn't have said that.
But it's really sketchy stuff. I'm not denying it, but I still have a soft spot for the fact they show a variety of deathways and a variety. And yes, burning boats are part of it, way overrepresented, but at least you get to see a really changing society and a really messed up mixed society. But yes, of course, there's so much wrong with it. But you know, the militarism, the hypersexualization, the gender roles, the spiritualism, but it's not kind of a faux spiritual. There's lots of things you can criticize. You know, no battle ever works like a battle would. You know, even if you go for the macho stuff, you know, there's but I still have a soft spot for some aspects of it.
Have you seen The Northman?
Yes. I did. I did hate that. I confess. I did.
You hated it.
I hated it.
I thought, it was. I don't know if it
was the most physically, materially accurate. In terms
that's what I was going to say. Really
costume.
Enjoyed the materiality of it, and I also enjoyed the fact that he, like Eggers, used a lot of the stuff from the sagas, like these elements, details. He used a lot of that. For example, when he fights the revenant, I like that very, very much.
Yes.
And the way he deals with the body, that is actually taken from, I think it's again the saga of Grettir. So I think he did a very good job in taking these elements and putting them together. I also enjoyed the imagery of the Yggdrasil. I think it was in a vision of some sort.
Okay.
Yeah, Mimir's head was also present, or some sort of Skurrinkan head. But of course, the old stereotypes remained. He really wanted to use the image of the berserker, which he did. Yeah, but then again, the attention to detail is a positive part, because that scene where he throws a spear, for example, and then he catches it again, that is attested in a couple of sagas. So yeah, I'm very, very torn between liking it and disliking it.
That's right. Okay. So that's, if I now you said that, I can sort of put it a different way. That I was blown over by how much effort they put into a material world that responds to academic debates as well as the sources. But I felt so utterly disappointed by how reductive it became. It just became...
Yeah, I think it became reductive because, as far as I know, he actually wanted to translate a saga on screen.
Yeah.
And if you want to try that, if you want to attempt that, you cannot give up the stereotypes. I think that was one of the reasons. And the second reason is that we actually need these stereotypes, or the broader audience needs them in order to, I don't know, because it's familiar, because you need something to identify yourself with, something you already know, so it automatically becomes more relatable. But I think his attempt of translating a saga on the screen was not really that successful, because beyond this obsession with masculinity, hypermasculinity, again, it's difficult to do that because sagas do not have character development, or they rarely do. They don't show the emotional life of the character. They don't show conversations between characters. They just have these very sporadic mentions of people talking to each other. So a lot of stuff is missing, but deliberately. like authorial intent, and I think that's very, very difficult to translate on screen. So that might have been one of the reasons why it didn't really work that well.
I think, yeah, when I have to admit to people that I thought I enjoyed Thor: Love and Thunder more than Northman, people are just going, "What? How can you? How can you? How? And I said, well, because it was a playful, ridiculous, taking it to a next level of silly, rendition of that modern era.
Yeah, maybe you don't have any expectations, right, from the Marvel movies.
Russell Crowe as Zeus or whatever it was, and it's all fun, but when I saw that, I thought, yeah, I love what they're doing. But then I can't help myself because I'm an archaeologist. So I keep thinking one of the big hilarious errors of all these shows is they don't include ditches because they're filming. They can't cut. They can't cut. But like if you're going to have a military attack on a fort, these forts weren't just. They had massive ditches. Like this is what we dig. This is what we know. And it's not just that film. It's every TV show has warriors just climbing up walls. And I'm going.
Yeah, because it's a visual effect. I mean, if there's a ditch there stopping you, I mean, how are you going to show the drama and the?
I know, but it sounds small, but it's actually fundamental because these are agricultural societies who spend a lot of their working life digging, draining water, putting up palisades and fences and curtailing animals and people, and so it's a pedantic thing. So I think they need to dig more ditches. And I also, but that's my other major bugbear about all of the zombie apocalypse films is that they and TV series is that if you just dug a ditch 1 foot deep, all of these zombies would fall over, game over. But instead
that would defy the purpose. No,
it would defy the purpose, but this is my mind, I'm afraid. But no, I think there's a lot of it's how to situate yourself in discussing these is not as they're all wrong all the time. But with Northman, I just had to come out and I thought I didn't do a proper review. I did a rant to YouTube and I just said I hated this and here's why. But I know they got proper historical advisors and I know that they did their work and that wasn't my problem. I didn't think that they represented things badly. It was just I thought this doesn't work. I'm not enjoying this. There's nothing. It's not fun. It's not even interesting. But that's just me. But no one's going to ask me to be an advisor on a film, so I'm free to just rant about these things. It's from the sidelines.
Yeah, no, I actually enjoyed it. I think I wrote now that I think of it, a little bit in a way too positive note about this film. But I think I compared it to other things I've seen about the medieval times, and I found it overall, because of the fact that he included so many of these details, I was actually very, very impressed. But yeah, the image with the berserker, I wouldn't have included it. I understand why he did it.
Yeah.
And I also understand why it was, again, appropriated by white supremacists, but yeah, they're going to find anything that fits their purpose.
If I was going to be positive, I would have to concede, hand on heart, that it's probably the first time anyone's attempted to try and accurately show a vaguely, historically, culturally, sensitive or. So it's the first.
It was immersive. Maybe. I mean, this is kind of like the way I would imagine an Icelandic saga to go on. Yeah.
I don't know. But maybe I was just in a bad mood, and I just thought, I turned up. Maybe I did a bit of a berserker myself when I saw it.
Yeah. Speaking of berserkers, historical or not?
No. I mean, I kind of see these as. I mean, I haven't read everything about it, but my sense of it is that we're dealing with legendary sources. I have sympathy with the idea that there would have been perhaps across time in Northern Europe animistic understandings of people and transformation, but I don't think I kind of assume we're just dealing with
I think that perhaps champions. Just very limited groups of people engaging maybe in some kind of regional cult or so on, linked to Odin, but like this very, very limited. We have the Torslunda plates, for example, depicting these naked warriors with horned helmets near other people. I think they're warriors too, or whatever, dressed up as boars. I think wolves as well. So I think there is a connection here as well. And we also have the Byzantine descriptions.
Yes.
From Konstantinos Porphyrogenitos, I think. He describes that ritual at the court with the two armies that clash. with each other, and I think he does describe them as being naked and so on. So I think there would have been something here, but definitely not something like large scale or anything
I think
of the sort.
intimidating.
Make him, yeah,
I think intimidating behaviours in battle,
yeah,
you
yeah,
know, I mean, are a major. I mean, psychological warfare. I mean, it would have been very important across
yeah,
cultures, and so I think I'm very sensitive to or sympathetic with that element. In the same way as I'm very, despite what I think some people have characterised me, I'm very sympathetic with the idea that almost every adult or adolescent would be competent in wielding an axe in the period, and that whether we have a institutionalized cult of shield maidens as the TV show Vikings portrays
yeah.
or
So I
not,
say, I think women too. I mean,
I
if the
think,
situation requires it from you, if a wild bear attacks you or whatever, then you're going to,
and I think so that I'm split
yeah,
between the modern stereotype of all women would be naturally unable to somehow, oh look, I can't pick this up, you know. I
yeah,
mean, if you are
yeah,
literally cutting wood every other day of your life, or every,
yeah,
you know,
exactly,
you are
yeah.
physically handling, you would know how to handle these farm tools and weapons, because they are, and spears, a spear is a hunting tool as well as you know, most of, there's only the, a few of the, only the battle axe and the sword and are the non hunting, non-utilitarian, you know,
Yeah, but
specialized
this is just
military.
the practical aspect. This is the
Yeah.
practical aspect. We can accept it because the circumstances would have dictated how you would have defended yourself and against whom. And it's a very different thing to, I don't know, conceptualize the existence of a band of women
Yeah.
under the guidance of Freya
Yeah.
going into battle and doing exactly the same thing as men. Yeah, I don't. I'm not
I
very
think,
convinced about those graves either, the
but then all
so-called
the
shield maiden
problem,
graves.
well, no, I'm not convinced, but equally the a lot of the, equally, having said I'm not convinced by that, I equally have no time for this hyper masculine, well, you know, if you were going to be, you know, the
Mm.
online chats are full of these bros just going, well, to be a man in that period you
Yeah.
had to do this, and they've got no
Mm.
clue. We're dealing with farmers and fishermen, mariners, who,
Exactly. Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, who would have opportunistically raided. The raids' major advantage was the speed of their ships, and I try to make this point, is the being a strong rower and having
It was hit and run. Yeah.
hit and run. There's no physical, because even one of the most pernicious myths I face online is, oh well, the Vikings were taller, the Vikings were stronger.
No, there's no
No,
evidence
you know,
for that.
and so we keep coming back to this idea, even the most informed voices, that somehow they were militaristically fatalistic, and we have academics who perpetuate that idea. And I think that's more dangerous than, I have no intellectual problem with the idea that some women would have been involved in combat. It's more the other side, this valorization of militarism, to the point that, I mean, it was a violent times, and I think that there were clearly an ideological component, but I don't think people were driven to, you know, go on 100,
Yeah, it
500
would have been
miles.
something that helped you. I mean, if
Yeah,
you're a warrior going into battle, yeah, it would have helped somehow to know that in the afterlife you would have enjoyed the presence of Odin and the other Einherjar in Valhall. But
yeah.
yeah, so as war propaganda, I think it would have been, you know,
Yes.
an impulse. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I've no objection to that. I think the way that we valorize that to the point of being an ideology, that would have driven people and motivated their actions from sitting in a farm going, what should we do with our spare time, through to, we must, you know, it still is with us. And I think we just have to be a bit cynical about that. But no, I don't. I think when we're dealing with this period, you know, there's so many myths and misconceptions, but I think that we can, there's some really, the cool stuff is better. And I think there's so much cool evidence of whether it's the ships or the burials or the material, you know,
Totally.
that we don't almost need it, really. It should be something that we can, you know, do without. But no, I kind of don't. I'm very sympathetic with the idea that there may have been human animal interactions that and relationships that are very different from our world, and, you know, but I don't think it was restricted only to bears, you know, or only to you know, wolves, and I think it would have been a lot of, you know, yeah. That's my feeling.
Yeah, well, to represent yourself as an animal, again, I think it would have been an impulse of some sort to, you know, facilitate your participation in these kinds of encounters, militaristic encounters. Like if you imagine strong enough that you are some sort of a wild animal, it would have helped perhaps with
Yeah.
the motivation, I guess.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. But you know, and again, I would imagine, going back to attitudes to the dead, I don't think many people would have literally taken a lot of this these were ideas about coping, about metaphors, and as I said, part of the practical technologies of dealing with the dead that would have allowed stories to be a part. I don't think we can separate these concepts out of that any more than you can take modern, I don't know, Orthodox or Catholic Christian ideas out of the context of dealing with your auntie who's passed away or dealing with your brother. People negotiate these ideas in very real world circumstances, and we should not, I think we have to be wary of trying to constantly abstract back to some sort of singular set of ideas that would have floated outside of that world. I think they would have constantly been dealing with these ideas. I'm not saying they didn't believe them, but I don't think they would have constantly been debating during the middle of a funeral. I know why you did that, because that's very much like when Balder was, no, I don't think there may have been one idiot in every village that did that, but I think most people would have taken it as less literally and less seriously, and it would have been just ways of coping with the world in which they're living in. It sounds very practical and boring, but I think it's important to remind ourselves of that.
Yeah,
which is why I love the first season of Norseman, Norseman with the firing arrow at and you can't fire the arrow.
Oh, right, yeah.
Because I think that does sort of embody so much about the practical limitations. And he goes, "Has anyone else tried to fire an arrow with cold fingers?" And they all go, "Yes." And I think it does reveal the realities behind our sort of our valorizations of death ritual.
Yeah, it was a communal effort and a communal coping mechanism. Probably a lot of emotion would have been involved as well. I also think it would be false to assume that, people back in the day, they were so familiarized with death that they wouldn't have been so affected like we are today. I mean, I don't know. I don't really imagine these people either trying to discuss rituals or myths from a fundamentalistic point of view when somebody dies or something like that. No.
And I think, that reacting to circumstance explains a lot of the deviant burials we're seeing, but not necessarily from they're not going back to a textbook or a runic textbook going, what do we do when someone is accidentally crushed beneath a boulder in a landslide? Oh, well, it would have been from memory. It would have been from what they remember happened previously, how they dealt with those situations. And I think that's always healthy to remember that.
Yep. Fascinating.
Well, it's good stuff, though, isn't it? I mean, I don't know really what we can say to conclude this discussion other than maybe, do you have any takeaways you think people could go further and read up about? What would you recommend them to, where would you recommend people to go to learn more about sort of Old Norse society and religion, if you want to put it that way? I mean, obviously you've got online courses that you do. Maybe that's the point we could mention those.
Yeah, about religion. Well, despite some ideas that maybe a little bit controversial, I think the Viking Way is probably the best course book I would think of right now. So Neil Price's The Viking Way. Yeah, definitely, because he covers a lot of interesting stuff, including the chapter about the shamanism, for example. I found very, very interesting. The Nova Devoita. So I think I would go to that book. It's a very large book. It's a very complex book. And I do enjoy very much that it has a lot of archaeological references as well. So I think that would be on the top of my list.
Great recommendation. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know. About the revenants. I don't think that we have a monography about revenants. So I think you should have to read the sagas first. Gretti's saga is one good example. Erbygja saga is, I think, my favorite saga, because it has so much supernatural in it. It has berserkers, it has revenants, it has ghosts, it has everything. It is my favorite saga in terms of how the supernatural is represented in Old Norse literature. So yeah. Erbygja saga, Gretti's saga. Laxdela saga also has an interesting character by the name of Hrapper.
Yes,
so
yes.
yeah, and I would also recommend the saga of Hrolf Kraki. which again has a lot of supernatural elements there. Also references to Seidr magic. Again, a late attempt to draw on all these pagan elements to try to construct an original story, more or less. And yeah, also references to Gamel Leire, since we mentioned it before.
Yes,
yeah, the
did,
King,
yeah.
King Hrolf. Yeah, exactly. And also the saga of Hervor and Heidrek, because it has that great conversation between Hervor, who tries to convince her father Angantyr to give her the sword, the Tyrfinger sword, because it was her heritage.
Going back to
And
graves.
I really enjoyed that saga. Yeah, I really enjoyed the saga because it presents her as a shield maiden in the first part, but then she reintegrates without any problems whatsoever in society in the second part of the story. So yeah, the author doesn't really seem to be very sexist, unlike the saga of Rolf Krake, which is very full of misogynistic remarks. So yeah. There's definitely a lot to see there in terms of mentalities and in terms of how medieval people interpreted their ancient past and what they made out of it.
I've got a question before we go. Who's your favorite ghost, though? Who's your favorite?
Oh, yeah, I think I'm going to stick with Thorolf because he has the most complex story, in my opinion, from all these sagas. But then again, like I said, I have a soft spot for Erbika saga. Yeah, but there are many great characters, I would say.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, thank you for the chat. And obviously, we're going to share this on both of our channels and put links in the description so that people can follow up and everything. But, you know, and we'll talk again, I think, because we've gotten on a, you know, I think unnecessarily
we have to.
Rambling, you know, but not rambling, but, you know, there's so many issues that I'm learning all the time. You know, as you know, I'm never claimed to be an expert in these written sources. And I just read some of the literature and I'm learning all about this stuff. So it's been a real privilege to listen to your perspectives and you know, I hope we keep chatting.
And I've started reading more about archaeology as well, because I also have this handicap, if I might say so, because I'm not an archaeologist, so I didn't really study archaeology on this academic scientific level. And I think the Viking Age needs all these disciplines in order to be properly analyzed. So I think, the level of interdisciplinarity in Viking studies nowadays is definitely something absolutely fascinating. So everything ranging from archaeology to Old Norse literature to runology and everything in between. So definitely we need bits from all of it. Yeah.
Follow ArchaeoDeath on YouTube, TikTok, WordPress, and a host of other social media.